In 2007, 7-year-old Leo Carter vanished from the crowded midway of the Oakhaven County Fair. One moment he was a flash of red t-shirt and wide, laughing eyes, clutching a half-eaten cone of cotton candy. The next he was gone. He dissolved into the throng of bodies, the cacophony of carnival music and the thick, sweet smell of fried dough and summer dust, as if he had never been there at all. The investigation that followed was frantic, then exhaustive, then heartbreakingly cold. Hundreds of volunteers, led by local law enforcement, scoured every inch of the fairgrounds and the surrounding woods. Flyers bearing Leo's gap-toothed smile yellowed on telephone poles and in storefront windows. His parents, David and Sarah, gave tearful, desperate pleas on the evening news, their faces becoming masks of a grief so profound it seemed to have physically aged them overnight. David, then a detective with the Oakhaven Police Department, nearly destroyed himself leading the search, poring over every dead-end lead, every false sighting, until his captain had to place him on indefinite leave. The official theory, the one that allowed the town to eventually sleep again, was that Leo had wandered off, gotten lost in the dense woods bordering the fair, and succumbed to the elements. There was no evidence, no body, just the cold comfort of a plausible tragedy. The case files were eventually boxed up, relegated to a dusty shelf in the archives, a monument to unanswered questions and enduring pain. But 17 years later, on a quiet Tuesday night in a house that had long ago fallen silent, a forgotten piece of celluloid would drag the ghost of that day back into the light, proving the accepted narrative was not just wrong, but a carefully constructed lie. David Carter, his hair now more silver than brown, his detective's posture softened by years of civilian life and unresolved sorrow, sat beside Sarah on their worn leather sofa. They rarely spoke of Leo anymore. His name was a fragile thing, best left undisturbed. Instead, they filled the evenings with the quiet hum of the television. Tonight, it was an obscure streaming service, one that specialized in digging up low-budget, forgotten films from the 90s and 2000s. The movie was called Harvest Moon, a grainy, poorly acted horror flick from 2007. They weren't really watching, just letting the flickering images fill the space between them. The plot was nonsensical, something about a cursed scarecrow. Then, a scene shifted to a busy city street, a generic establishing shot meant to convey urban dread. The camera panned clumsily across a crowd of extras, and for a fraction of a second, among the blurry, indifferent faces, a boy stood on the curb. He was small, wearing a red t-shirt, looking directly into the camera. His face was pale, his expression not one of a paid extra, but one of profound, haunting confusion. The camera moved on. David didn't react at first. His mind was a slow, rusted engine. But Sarah gasped, a sharp, ragged intake of breath that cut through the room's stale air. "David," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "Rewind it. Go back." His fingers felt thick and clumsy on the remote. He fumbled, rewinding the digital stream. He played it again. The pan. The crowd. And there he was. The image was low resolution, filmed on cheap stock, but there was no mistaking it. The cowlick on his right temple. The small, crescent-shaped scar above his left eyebrow from a fall off his bicycle. The distinct, slightly asymmetrical set of his eyes. It was Leo. It was their son, 17 years younger, staring out from the screen as if from a tomb. It wasn't just a resemblance, it was him. A cold, electric shock jolted through David, snapping 17 years of carefully managed numbness. The boy wasn't laughing. He wasn't holding cotton candy. He was standing alone on a city street, in a movie filmed months after he had supposedly vanished into the woods 100 miles away. The official story, the one that had been the foundation of their grieving, fractured and fell away, revealing a chasm of terrifying new possibilities. The boy on the screen was lost, and for the first time in 17 years, David felt a flicker of the one thing he thought had died with his son, a lead. The hunt was on again. The hum of the television was replaced by a roaring in David's ears. The world shrank to the size of the screen, to the ghostly, pixelated face of his son. He replayed the 4-second clip over and over, his finger jabbing the rewind button with a manic rhythm. Each viewing was a fresh stab of pain and a surge of adrenaline. Leo, standing there, his red shirt, the same one from the fair, looked dull under the harsh city lighting. There was no one with him. He wasn't looking at an adult or a friend. He was looking straight down the barrel of the camera lens, an island of stillness in a river of motion. Sarah was weeping silently beside him, her shoulders shaking. The grief was new again, sharp and terrifying, no longer the blunted ache of memory but a living, breathing monster in their living room. "It's him," she choked out between sobs. "Oh God, David, it's him. Where is he? What is that?" The old instincts, buried under years of selling insurance and trying to forget, clawed their way to the surface. David's mind, once a labyrinth of case files and evidence boards, began to click and whir. He paused the image, Leo's face frozen in a haunting tableau of confusion. He took a photo of the screen with his phone, then another of the movie's title card, Harvest Moon. Directed by Julian Crane. Copyright 2007. He worked through the night. While Sarah eventually cried herself to a fitful sleep on the sofa, David turned their quiet suburban home into a makeshift command center. He unearthed his old laptop, its keys sticky with disuse, and began to dig. Harvest Moon was a ghost itself. A direct-to-video flop, it had a negligible online footprint. A few scathing reviews on a defunct horror forum, a trivia page noting its shoestring budget and troubled production. It was filmed in the fall of 2007, 3 months after Leo disappeared. The street scene, according to one reviewer's complaint about inconsistent locations, was shot in the city of Northgate, 2 hours from Oakhaven. 2 hours. Not an impossible distance, but it obliterated the theory of a boy lost in the local woods. This wasn't an accident. This was an abduction. By dawn, David's face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, but a grim fire burned within them. He showered, put on a suit that felt alien on his body, and drove to the Oakhaven Police Department. The building was newer, more modern than the one he'd left, but the smell was the same: stale coffee, disinfectant, and quiet desperation. He didn't have an appointment. He walked straight to the front desk and asked for the head of detectives. A young officer, barely older than Leo would be now, regarded him with a polite, vacant stare. Finally, a man in a rumpled suit emerged from a back office. Detective Miller. He was in his late 30s, with a weary, cynical look David knew well. David had trained men like Miller. "Mr. Carter," Miller said, his tone laced with a cautious pity. He knew who David was. Everyone in the department did. They were led to a small, sterile interview room. The air was cold. "What can I do for you?" David didn't waste time with pleasantries. He pushed his phone across the table. "My son, Leo." He played the clip. Miller watched, his expression unreadable. He watched it again. That movie was filmed in Northgate. 3 months after he went missing from the fair. Miller leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Mr. Carter." "David. I understand. After all this time, the mind can play tricks. It's a low-quality video. It could be any kid who looks a little like him." "It's not any kid," David said, his voice low and dangerous. The knuckles of his right hand were white where he gripped the edge of the table. "Look at the scar over his eye. Look at his ears. I spent 5 years of my life memorizing every detail on that missing poster. That is my son." He could see the wall of professional skepticism going up in Miller's eyes. A grieving father, clinging to a phantom. A cold case best left cold. "We concluded he was lost in the woods," Miller said gently. "The search was the most extensive in this department's history." "Your conclusion was wrong," David snapped, the force of his words startling even himself. "You were wrong. I was wrong. We were all wrong. He wasn't in the woods. Someone took him. And whoever it was, they were careless enough to let him be filmed on a movie set. I need you to find out who was behind that camera." Miller sighed, the sound of a man burdened by too many tragedies and not enough resources. "Okay, David. I'll make some calls. I'll look into the production company, see if we can get a cast and crew list. But I need you to manage your expectations. It's been 17 years. David stood up, his chair scraping against the linoleum. "My expectations died 17 years ago, detective. This is something else. This is a thread, and I'm going to pull on it, with or without your help." He walked out of the station, the morning sun feeling harsh and unforgiving. He knew Miller would make a few calls, file a perfunctory report. But this was his son, his case. The department had failed him once. He wouldn't give them the chance to do it again. The hunt was his and his alone. David's first stop was his own attic. Among the boxes of seasonal decorations and forgotten mementos was a heavy-duty plastic tote labeled Leo, personal. He hadn't opened it since the year after the disappearance. The latches protested with a loud crack, breaking the dusty seal. The air inside smelled of childhood, of crayon wax and laundry soap. He bypassed the neatly folded clothes and the favorite bedtime storybooks, his fingers searching for a small, velvet-lined box. Inside was Leo's treasure collection: a smooth river stone, a bottle cap, a cicada shell, and a small platoon of green plastic army men. He picked one up, a soldier brandishing a tiny bazooka. Leo had loved these, setting them up in intricate battle formations across the living room carpet. David put the toy soldier in his pocket, a tangible link to the boy he was hunting. His next step was tracking down Julian Crane, the director of Harvest Moon. It wasn't difficult. Crane hadn't exactly ascended to the heights of Hollywood. He was now running a wedding videography business out of a cramped apartment in a rundown part of Northgate. David found the address and drove the 2 hours, the highway miles stretching out before him like a timeline he was trying to reverse. Crane's apartment smelled of stale cigarettes and regret. The man himself was a shadow of the confident, edgy artist pictured on the old horror forums. He was paunchy, with thinning hair and the haunted, defensive eyes of a man whose dreams had curdled. David introduced himself not as a grieving father, but as a freelance journalist researching a piece on forgotten indie cinema. It was a thin lie, but it got him through the door. Harvest Moon. Crane scoffed, taking a long drag from his cigarette. God, that mess. Why would anyone want to write about that disaster? They sat in a cluttered living room, surrounded by stacks of DVDs and dusty camera equipment. David kept his demeanor calm, professional. It was an interesting production, David said, probing. I heard it was privately funded. Crane's eyes narrowed slightly. Yeah, some rich guy. An arts benefactor, he called himself. Never met him. All the money came through a lawyer. It was weird. He had stipulations. We had to shoot certain B-roll shots in specific places, even if they didn't make sense for the movie. Like that street corner scene. Pointless. But his money paid the bills. David felt his pulse quicken. So the benefactor chose the locations? Some of them, Crane confirmed, shrugging. It was a trade-off. We got a budget. We had to shoot some garbage footage for his personal collection, or whatever. Look, the whole shoot was a nightmare. The crew was non-union. The actors were amateurs. I was just trying to get a feature film made. I took the money and didn't ask a lot of questions. David slid his phone across the coffee table. The image of Leo paused on the screen. One of your extras. Do you remember him? Crane squinted at the phone. He took a long, hard look. He shook his head slowly. Kid looks familiar, maybe. But we had dozens of people walking through those shots. I couldn't pick one out of a lineup. It was chaos. We just set up the camera and roll, grab whatever we could. Guerrilla style. The denial felt genuine, but there was a flicker of something else in Crane's eyes, the unease of a memory best left buried. Do you have any production documents? David pressed. Call sheets? Location permits? Anything? Crane laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Man, that was 17 years and 3 evictions ago. I've got nothing. It's all gone. Listen, I appreciate you thinking my schlock is worth an article, but I've got a wedding montage to edit. The happy couple wants more lens flare. He was shutting down, pushing David out. As David stood to leave, he felt the cold plastic of the toy soldier in his pocket. It was a long shot, an act of pure desperation. The shoot was chaotic, David said, his voice changing, losing the journalistic pretense and taking on the hard edge of his former profession. Things get left behind. Did you shoot anywhere outside the city? A rural location, maybe? Crane paused at the door, his hand on the knob. He seemed to be searching his memory. Yeah, one. It was another one of the benefactor's requests. A creepy, abandoned farmhouse way out in the sticks. We shot for a day out there. The place gave me the creeps. Looked like people had just up and left. We weren't supposed to go inside, just shoot the exterior, but it was part of the deal. Crane finally looked David square in the eyes. Why are you really here? Who are you? David didn't answer. He just nodded slowly. Thank you for your time, Mr. Crane. He walked away, leaving the director standing in his doorway, wreathed in smoke and confusion. An abandoned farmhouse. A location chosen by an anonymous, wealthy benefactor. The thread was getting thicker. David Carter, the insurance salesman, was gone. Detective Carter was back, and he was heading for the countryside. The drive to find the farmhouse was a journey into the forgotten folds of the county map. Crane had given him a vague description. West of the city, off Route 9, past the old stone quarry. But it was enough for David to piece together a potential area. He spent an hour cross-referencing old property maps with satellite images on his laptop at a gas station cafe, the coffee growing cold beside him. He finally found it, a derelict structure at the end of a long, unpaved road, surrounded by a thick cordon of overgrown trees, virtually invisible from the main route. The property records were a dead end, listing the owner as a numbered corporation based out of a P.O. box. Another layer of anonymity. As he turned onto the dirt road, the suspension of his sedan groaning in protest, the air grew still and heavy. Weeds choked the path, scraping against the undercarriage of his car like skeletal fingers. The place felt wrong. It felt sick. He parked where the road became impassable and continued on foot. The farmhouse emerged from the trees like a rotted tooth. Its siding was warped and gray, windows like vacant eyes, a porch sagging in a permanent frown. The no trespassing sign nailed to a tree was so rusted it was nearly illegible. David ignored it. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of his own footsteps on the dry leaves and the frantic thumping of his own heart. He circled the house first, his old training dictating the rhythm of his movements. The barn beside it had collapsed in on itself, a heap of splintered wood. Everything was decaying, returning to nature, but the decay felt unnatural, accelerated. He approached the front porch, the steps creaking under his weight. The front door was boarded up, but a window on the side had been smashed, a dark, gaping hole. He peered inside, but it was too dark to see anything but shadows. He didn't have a warrant, and he wasn't a cop anymore, but that didn't matter. This was where the thread had led him. He walked the perimeter of the house again, his eyes scanning the ground, looking for anything out of place. It was near the back of the house, half buried in the packed dirt beneath the peeling clapboard, that he saw it. A glint of dark green plastic. He knelt, his knees cracking. He used his car key to carefully excavate the object from the earth. His breath hitched. It was a toy soldier. Not just any toy soldier, but one identical to the set in the box in his attic. This one was a rifleman, aiming his weapon at some unseen, long-forgotten enemy. The plastic was weathered and faded, caked with years of dirt, but it was undeniably the same. Leo had a habit of losing them, leaving a trail of plastic casualties wherever he played. David's mind flashed back to the fair, to Leo begging for one more ride on the Ferris wheel, his pockets bulging with these same little green men. He had been here. His son had stood on this ground. He had played in this dirt. The certainty of it was a physical blow, knocking the wind from his lungs. This wasn't just a movie location. This was a crime scene. A 17-year-old crime scene. He carefully placed the soldier in an evidence bag he still kept in the glove compartment of his car, a relic from his past life that was now suddenly, horribly relevant. The air grew colder, the shadows of the trees lengthening as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The farmhouse no longer looked merely abandoned, it looked predatory. David felt a chilling certainty that something monstrous had happened here, something far worse than a simple kidnapping. He backed away from the house, his gaze fixed on the dark, broken window, a gnawing dread coiling in his stomach. He had found proof that Leo was here, but the discovery brought no relief. It only deepened the mystery and amplified the terror. What happened to a little boy in a place this isolated, this evil? He clutched the evidence bag in his hand, the small plastic figure inside a heavy, terrible weight. He had the where. Now he needed the who and the why. The fluorescent lights of the Oakhaven Police Department hummed with an oppressive monotony. David sat across from Detective Miller again, the small plastic bag containing the toy soldier lying on the table between them like a challenge. Miller stared at it, then back at David, his professional skepticism warring with the undeniable gravity of the find. "His prints will be gone, David," Miller said, his voice softer this time, the patronizing edge gone. "After 17 years in the dirt, any DNA would be degraded beyond use." "It doesn't matter," David replied, his voice raspy with exhaustion. "I know it's his. His mother knows it's his. It puts him at that farmhouse. The farmhouse that was used as a filming location for that movie. The movie he appeared in months after he was declared a missing person presumed dead. Are you still telling me this is a coincidence?" Miller ran a hand over his tired face. He picked up the bag, looking at the small green figure. "No," he said finally. "I'm not. This is enough. I'll open a preliminary file. We'll treat the farmhouse as a potential crime scene." It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. For the first time, the official apparatus of the law was grinding back into motion on Leo's behalf. Miller dispatched a forensics team to the farmhouse, though both men knew the chances of finding anything significant after so long were slim. The real work began with the paper trail. Miller, with the full resources of the department, could dive into the labyrinth of shell corporations that David had only been able to scratch the surface of. For 2 days they worked. Miller and his small team dug into digital archives and property records, While David sat in the corner of the briefing room, a ghost at the feast, poring over the meager production details of Harvest Moon. The name of the corporation that owned the farmhouse was Kronos Ventures, LLC. It was a dead end, registered by a law firm that specialized in client anonymity. The money trail was a series of ghost accounts and transfers, designed to be untraceable. Frustration mounted. The thread was fraying. On the third day, as David was about to leave the station, feeling the familiar chill of a case going cold, a visitor arrived at the Carter home. It was Arthur Finch. Finch was a pillar of Oakhaven society, a self-made millionaire in commercial real estate who had transitioned into a celebrated philanthropist. He was handsome, silver-haired, with a reassuring smile and a calm, deep voice that commanded respect. Back in 2007, he had been a driving force in the search for Leo, funding a massive volunteer effort out of his own pocket, printing tens of thousands of flyers, and establishing a substantial reward for information. He had become a friend, or as close to a friend as David and Sarah could manage in their grief. He'd check in on them every few years, a solemn ritual of remembrance. "Sarah told me the police were looking into things again," Finch said, standing in their doorway, his expression a perfect portrait of compassionate concern. "I just came to see how you were holding up, to offer my support in any way I can." David stared at him. He saw the expensive, tailored suit, the confident posture, the concerned look in his eyes that had always seemed so genuine. But now, filtered through the lens of his renewed suspicion, something felt off. It was too smooth, too practiced. Finch had been there from the beginning. He had helped shape the narrative of Leo getting lost. He had paid for the flyers that sent everyone looking in the wrong place, in the woods. An icy dread, formless and terrifying, began to crystallize in David's gut. It was an investigator's intuition, the kind of gut feeling that had solved cases for him in the past, a feeling that defied logic but screamed the truth. "We're fine, Arthur. Thank you for coming by," David said, his voice tight. "It's probably nothing. A false lead." He needed to get Finch out of his house. The man's presence suddenly felt like a violation. After Finch left, leaving behind the scent of expensive cologne and a hollow promise to help, David's mind raced. Finch. The benefactor for the movie was a wealthy, anonymous arts patron. Finch was a wealthy, public arts patron. The farmhouse was owned by a corporation that specialized in anonymity. Finch, with his army of lawyers and accountants, could create such a thing in his sleep. It was insane. Arthur Finch was a local hero. He sponsored Little League teams. He sat on the board of the Children's Hospital. But intuition was a weapon, and David's was screaming. Later that night, Miller called. His voice was different. Tense. "David, we got a hit. The forensics team at the farmhouse. They didn't find much. The place was swept clean, but they took extensive soil samples from the entire property, trying to map out any disturbances. The soil on your toy soldier contained the expected dirt and clay from the farmhouse grounds, but it also had trace amounts of a very specific, rare mineral, a type of feldspar variant unique to the geology of this region." David held his breath. "And it only occurs in one other place in this entire county, David," Miller said, his voice dropping. "On a 30-acre patch of land about 5 miles from the farmhouse. The land is part of a private estate. It belongs to Arthur Finch." The world tilted on its axis. The formless dread now had a name. David's hand tightened on the phone, his knuckles turning white. The local hero, the family friend, the man who had hugged Sarah and assured David they would find their son, was now bound to the crime scene by a thread of microscopic dust. The monster had been in their house all along. The revelation landed like a physical blow, sucking the air from David's lungs. Arthur Finch. The name echoed in his mind, a discordant symphony of kindness and horror. The man who had organized search parties, who had stood beside him at press conferences, his face a mask of civic duty and shared grief. It was monstrous. It was unbelievable. And yet, the microscopic grains of feldspar on a child's toy were an incorruptible witness, linking the philanthropist's pristine estate to the rotting farmhouse where Leo's trail had reappeared. David's intuition had been a whisper, but now forensics had given it a voice. He felt a cold, terrifying clarity. The entire search, funded and guided by Finch, had been a masterful act of misdirection, sending hundreds of people, including David himself, on a pointless hunt through the woods while the real crime scene sat undisturbed miles away. The philanthropy wasn't kindness, it was a shield. The community events Finch sponsored, the galas, the youth centers, were they all just a hunting ground? A way to gain access, to observe, to select? The thought was so vile it made him physically ill. He spent the night sleeplessly, piecing together a new timeline, a new reality. Finch, the respected benefactor, approaches Julian Crane, the desperate filmmaker. He offers to fund the movie with a few simple conditions: use of a specific, isolated farmhouse he owns through a shell company, and the filming of some personal B-roll. It was the perfect cover. No one would question a film crew. Any strange activity could be dismissed as part of the movie. And in the background of this chaotic, low-budget production, a real horror story was unfolding just out of frame. Detective Miller, now a full-throated convert to David's cause, moved with surprising speed. He couldn't get a warrant for Finch's home based on trace minerals alone, but he could get one for the financial records of Kronos Ventures LLC. He and his team descended into a world of encrypted ledgers and offshore accounts, a fortress of wealth designed to hide secrets. While they worked, David began his own, more personal investigation. He started digging into Finch's public history, looking for cracks in the flawless facade. He spent hours in the library archives, scrolling through microfiche of old newspapers, searching for Finch's name in connection to anything out of the ordinary. He found a pattern. Over a 10-year period spanning 5 different counties, Finch's philanthropic endeavors, particularly those involving large public events for children, often coincided with a statistically significant, albeit small, uptick in missing children's cases. They were all written off as runaways or accidents, just like Leo's. None of them were ever solved. Individually, they were tragic anomalies. But when mapped against Finch's movements and charitable activities, they formed a chilling constellation. He was a predator who moved with the patient, calculating precision of a spider weaving a web. The most difficult part of this new reality was Sarah. He had to tell her. He found her in the garden, tending to a bed of roses that had been her one solace over the years. He laid out the evidence as gently as he could: the movie, the farmhouse, the toy soldier, the soil, the connection to Finch. She listened, her face growing paler with each word. When he was finished, she shook her head, her eyes wide with disbelief and horror. "No," she whispered. "Not Arthur. He was so kind. He held my hand at the memorial service. He cried with us." "It was an act, Sarah," David said, his voice heavy with a grief he couldn't show. He was playing a part. The whole town was his audience. "But why? Why Leo?" she cried, the question that had tormented them for 17 years. What did he want with him? It was a question David couldn't answer, a black hole at the center of his investigation. The motive remained terrifyingly elusive. The conversation was a new kind of torture, shattering the fragile peace they had built over the ruins of their old life. For Sarah, Finch was a symbol of the community's support. To be told he was the author of their pain was a betrayal, so profound it threatened to break her completely. She retreated into a shell of shocked silence, leaving David more alone than ever. The weight of the truth was his to carry. He was no longer just a father searching for his son. He was a man hunting a monster who wore the face of a friend. The veil of respectability was being peeled back, and what lay beneath was darker than anything he had ever imagined. The call from Miller came late at night, crackling with a wired energy that spoke of a breakthrough. "We're in," he said, his voice low. "The warrant for Kronos Ventures came through. We're deep in the financial records. You were right, David. It's all him." The ledgers were a masterclass in obfuscation, but Miller's forensic accountants had found the weak link. They uncovered a series of structured payments from a private Finch account to Kronos, and from Kronos to Julian Crane, the director. But there was more. They found invoices for the construction of a high-tech, soundproof studio on the farmhouse property, and for its complete dismantlement and disposal just weeks after filming on Harvest Moon Wrapped. The project had an internal codename in the financial logs, the Kronos Archive. It wasn't just a movie set, it was a purpose-built facility. He built a studio in the middle of nowhere, used a movie as a cover, and then wiped it off the face of the earth, Miller explained, the disbelief evident in his voice. He was archiving something, David. Or someone. The word archive sent a fresh wave of ice through David's veins. It was cold, clinical, detached. It spoke of collection, of preservation. The horror of it began to take a more defined shape. Finch wasn't a kidnapper in the traditional sense. He wasn't after ransom. He was a collector. A collector of children. This realization propelled David to take a huge risk. He called Julian Crane again. This time, there were no pretenses. "This is David Carter," he said, his voice like cold iron. "Leo Carter's father. The boy you filmed on that street corner in 2007. The police are involved now, and they know Arthur Finch funded your movie. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, then the sound of a shaky exhale. Crane's cavalier defensiveness was gone, replaced by pure fear. I didn't know, Crane stammered. I swear to God, I didn't know anything about a kid. The money was good. The instructions were weird. He wanted raw footage. Unedited. Hours of it. What kind of footage, Julian? David pressed, his heart hammering. Just life. Street scenes. Playgrounds. Schoolyards. He called them ambient portraits. Said it was for a modern art project. He paid a fortune for the tapes. All the raw dailies, everything we shot. He took every last bit. An art project. An archive. It was all the same twisted obsession. Finch wasn't just abducting children. He was curating them, capturing their lives on film for his own perverse, private gallery. Leo's appearance in the final cut of Harvest Moon must have been a mistake, a single frame that slipped through the cracks in an otherwise meticulously controlled operation. Miller's team, armed with this new information, secured a broader warrant. They subpoenaed the archives of the now-defunct film distribution company, searching for the raw footage Finch had so desperately acquired. It was a needle in a haystack, hours upon hours of uncatalogued film reels and digital tapes stored in a climate-controlled vault in another state. While the police searched, David felt a new, agonizing thought take root. If Leo was part of an archive, was it possible he wasn't the only one? He went back to his research, to the maps and news articles about missing children in other counties. He cross-referenced the dates of their disappearances with Finch's known travel and his charitable donations. The pattern was undeniable. A dozen children over 15 years, all vanished without a trace, all within the sphere of Finch's influence. He presented his findings to Miller, his hands shaking as he laid out the photos of the smiling, innocent faces. He didn't just take Leo, David said, his voice breaking. He was a serial predator. All these kids, they were all written off. Runaways. Accidents. No one ever connected them. The scope of the horror was expanding exponentially, becoming a vast, dark conspiracy orchestrated by one man hiding in plain sight. Miller stared at the photos, his face ashen. The case was no longer about a single missing boy from Oakhaven. It was about a monster who had been preying on the innocent for decades, using his wealth and reputation as the perfect camouflage. The weight of all those lost children, all those grieving families, now rested on their shoulders. And somewhere, in a vault, the visual record of Finch's unspeakable crimes was waiting to be found. The hunt was no longer just for Leo, it was for all of them. The call that changed everything came at 3:17 a.m. It was Miller, his voice strained, a mixture of triumph and profound disturbance. They found it, David, an archivist at the vault. He found a set of tapes labeled Kronos Archive. They're sending us the digital copies now. David drove to the station through the deserted streets, his mind a maelstrom of hope and terror. What would he see? Would Leo be alive? Would he be okay? The questions were a form of torture. He was led to a darkened viewing room where Miller and two other somber-faced detectives were waiting. A large monitor glowed in the center of the room. I have to warn you, Miller said, his hand on the mouse. What we've seen so far, it's not easy. David just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He sat down, his eyes locked on the screen. Miller clicked play. The footage was raw, unedited, and chillingly mundane. It was a long, static shot of a playground. Children laughed and screamed, a scene of pure innocence. But as the camera slowly zoomed, it settled on one small boy sitting alone on a bench, listlessly drawing in the dirt with a stick. David recognized him from one of the photos. A boy named Michael, who had vanished from a town picnic 2 years before Leo. There was no visible threat, no overt violence. But the clinical, detached nature of the filming, the patient focus on a single, isolated child was deeply sinister. They watched for hours. Tape after tape revealed the same horrifying pattern. Scenes from parks, schoolyards, and fairs. In each one, a different child, a child David recognized from his grim research, was the unwitting subject. They were filmed from a distance, captured in moments of solitude. It was a gallery of lost children, their last recorded moments of freedom. Then, they found the tapes from the farmhouse. The footage shifted from public spaces to a single, sparsely furnished room. It was clean, almost sterile, with a small bed, a table, and a single barred window. The camera was hidden, a fixed eye in the corner of the room. And there, sitting on the edge of the bed, was Leo. He was older than in the movie clip, perhaps 8 or 9. His face was thin, his eyes holding a haunted, vacant look that shattered David's heart into a million pieces. He was holding a green toy soldier, turning it over and over in his hands. He didn't speak. He just sat there, a prisoner in a silent, white room. Sarah's words echoed in David's mind. What did he want with him? The answer was on the screen. He wanted to possess him, to preserve him like a butterfly pinned under glass, capturing his innocence before the world could touch it. He wasn't just a collector, he was a curator of stolen lives. They watched in horrified silence as the tapes chronicled months, perhaps years, of Leo's captivity. They saw other children in other, identical rooms. They saw a woman, her face never shown, bringing them food on a tray. They saw no violence, no abuse in the conventional sense, just the soul-crushing monotony of confinement. Finch wasn't a monster of passion, he was a monster of control. The final tape was dated 2 years after Leo's abduction. The footage showed Leo lying in the small bed, his breathing shallow. He looked weak, pale. The unseen woman entered, checked on him, and then left, her movements efficient and detached. The camera kept rolling. It rolled as Leo's breathing grew fainter, and then, as it stopped altogether. The camera continued to film the still, small body for another hour before the screen went black. A strangled cry escaped David's lips. The last flicker of desperate hope he had harbored, that Leo might still be out there, alive, was extinguished in an instant. He saw the entire, horrific truth. Finch hadn't just stolen his son's life, he had documented its slow, quiet fading. Miller gently stopped the video. The silence in the room was a physical weight. David sat there, hollowed out, the images seared into his brain. The grief was no longer a dull ache. It was a white-hot, purifying rage. He now knew what had happened to his son. He knew who was responsible. And he knew that a legal process of warrants and arrests was not enough. He needed to see the monster's face. He needed a confession. He stood up, his movements stiff. "Where does he live?" he asked, his voice a dead whisper. Miller knew what he was thinking. "David, don't. We have everything we need. We'll have an arrest warrant by morning. Let us handle it." But David was already walking toward the door, his purpose absolute. He wasn't a cop anymore. He wasn't just a grieving father. He was an executioner of truth, and he was going to make Arthur Finch look into the eyes of the man whose life he had destroyed. The drive to Arthur Finch's estate was surreal. David moved through the pre-dawn darkness like a phantom, his grief and rage forged into a singular, cold purpose. He wasn't sure what he would do when he got there, only that he had to confront him. The legal system would provide justice, but David needed something more primal. He needed to witness the collapse of the man who had hidden his monstrousness behind a mask of benevolence for so long. Finch lived in a modern palace of glass and steel, a stark architectural statement perched on a hill overlooking the town. It was a fortress, cold and impersonal, surrounded by manicured lawns and sculpted trees. The entire property was an extension of the man himself, controlled, sterile, and impenetrable. There was a high-tech security gate, but David didn't need it. He parked his car down the road and walked through the woods, using the cover of darkness, his old field craft returning to him as if he'd never left the force. He found a low spot in the perimeter wall and scaled it, landing silently on the damp grass. He approached the house, a dark monolith against the lightning sky. A light was on in a ground-floor study. He could see Finch's silhouette moving inside. David didn't bother with stealth anymore. He walked across the lawn, his footsteps loud on the stone patio. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling glass wall of the study and waited. Finch turned, a glass of what looked like whiskey in his hand. He didn't look surprised or scared. He looked expectant. He tilted his head, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. He pressed a button on his desk, and the glass door slid open with a soft hiss. "David," Finch said, his voice as calm and smooth as ever. "I was wondering when you'd arrive. I've been following the news. Detective Miller is a surprisingly tenacious man." Finch gestured to a leather armchair opposite his desk. "Please, come in." The study was like a museum. Abstract art adorned the walls, and minimalist sculptures sat on pedestals. It was a room devoid of warmth or personal touches, a showroom for a man with impeccable taste and a hollow soul. David remained standing. "The Kronos Archive," David said, the words tasting like poison. "That's what you called it." Finch took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving David's. "A fitting name, don't you think? From Kronos, the personification of time. I wasn't just taking children, David. I was saving them, preserving them. capturing their essence at the peak of its purity, before the world could tarnish it with its ugliness, its disappointments. He spoke with the passionless air of an academic discussing a thesis. There was no remorse, no guilt. Only an unshakable, psychopathic conviction. "You filmed them," David said, his voice shaking with a rage he could barely contain. "You locked them in rooms and you filmed them like lab rats." "I curated them," Finch corrected, a flicker of annoyance in his tone. "I gave them a quiet, orderly existence. I protected them from the chaos of life. The films are a testament to their innocence. A perfect, unchanging record. It's a form of immortality, in a way. Leo will be 7 years old forever, in my collection." The casual, possessive way he said Leo's name broke something inside David. He took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. "He wasn't 7. I saw the tapes. He grew up in your box. He got sick. And you watched him die." Finch's calm finally fractured. A flash of genuine anger crossed his face. "He got sick because his spirit was weak," he snapped, his voice rising for the first time. "He began to want things. He asked for his mother. He asked to go home. The purity was becoming corrupted. He was being tainted from the inside out. Sickness was inevitable. It was a flaw in the specimen, not in the process. It was the confession. Clinical, horrifying, and utterly without remorse." Finch saw Leo not as a child, but as a flawed acquisition. David stared at the man, at the monster who had masqueraded as a friend, and felt a profound, bottomless emptiness. There was nothing human here to appeal to, no soul to confront. Just a void. "All those other children," David whispered. "Are they?" "They are safe," Finch said, regaining his composure. "They're part of the archive. Some, like Leo, were flawed. Others were more resilient. They have been preserved." Just as Finch finished his sentence, the world outside the glass wall exploded in light. Blue and red strobes painted the manicured lawn, and the sound of approaching sirens tore through the morning stillness. David hadn't come alone. He had called Miller from the road, telling him where he was going. He knew he couldn't trust himself. Miller's team swarmed the property, tactical officers in full gear surrounding the house. The game was over. Finch looked at the flashing lights, not with fear, but with a kind of detached disappointment, like a collector whose prized exhibition had been shut down. "A shame," he said, looking at David. "You could never understand the beauty of it. The art." "It wasn't art," David said, his voice finally steady clear. "It was murder." The glass door slid open again, and Miller stepped in, his gun drawn. "Arthur Finch, you're under arrest." Finch offered no resistance. He placed his glass carefully on the desk, straightened his jacket, and held his wrists out for the handcuffs as if he were trying on a pair of expensive cufflinks. His expression was one of mild irritation, not fear. As they led him away, he looked back at David, his eyes cold and empty. "You took my life's work," he said, the words devoid of emotion. "But you can't erase it. It exists. He exists. Forever." The words were meant to be a final, cruel twist of the knife, but they had no effect. David felt nothing but a vast, hollow quiet where his rage had been. He watched them put the monster in the back of a police car and drive him away, the sirens now a receding cry in the brightening dawn. The resolution was swift. The footage from the Kronos archive was the core of the prosecution's case. It was irrefutable, a silent, damning testimony from the victims themselves. Finch's lawyers attempted an insanity defense, but his clinical confession to David and his meticulous, long-term planning painted a clear picture of a calculating, organized predator, not a man detached from reality. He was found guilty on multiple counts of kidnapping and murder. The trial brought forth the stories of the other families, a chorus of grief that echoed David and Sarah's. Some of the children in the archive were found alive, physically unharmed but psychologically shattered, in a secure, hidden facility Finch owned in another state. Their recovery would be a long, arduous road, but they were home. For the Carters, there was no such reunion. There was only the terrible, final truth. They held a new funeral for Leo, a proper one this time. They buried an empty casket, but they were burying him in their hearts, finally able to mourn the boy they knew, not the ghost who had haunted them for 17 years. They had a small, marble headstone placed in the Oakhaven cemetery. It read, "Leo Carter, beloved son, at rest at last." Months later, David and Sarah stood before it, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass. The air was crisp, the leaves on the trees turning to gold and red. It was the same time of year he had vanished. For 17 years, autumn had been a season of unbearable pain, a constant reminder of what they had lost. But this year, something was different. The silence between them was no longer heavy with unspoken questions and gnawing uncertainty. It was a shared, peaceful quiet. The long, agonizing mystery was over. The gaping wound in their lives had not healed, it never would, but it had finally been cleaned. They knew what had happened. They knew who was responsible. And they knew that justice, in its slow, imperfect way, had been served. Sarah reached out and took David's hand. Her grip was firm, her skin warm against his. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, and saw not just the shared pain in her eyes, but a flicker of resilience, a spark of the woman he had married so long ago. "It's over," she whispered, her voice clear. "He's at peace now, David. We can be too." David squeezed her hand, a lifetime of sorrow and love passing between them in that simple touch. He looked at the name carved into the stone, the name of the boy who would be forever 7 in his memory. The ghost was finally laid to rest. The hunt was over. They turned and walked away from the grave, hand in hand, two survivors stepping out of the long, dark shadow of the past and into the uncertain light of what came next, together.